If you want to study the doctrine of the atonement, if you want to think about it well, you have to understand Napoleon, Francis Bacon, and Schleiermacher. Okay? So early 1800s, Napoleon utterly humiliated Prussia, just wrecked it. And out of that, the rubble, they needed to rebuild. They needed to do something about their country because they'd just been owned by the French. As part of that effort, they thought, well, okay, let's rebuild our education system. So let's find some way to make our the whole educational program excellent. Let's make this thing amazing. And that's where Francis Bacon comes in for the century or two before this defeat. The sciences had been making all this amazing progress. All these things were being discovered, all these new insights. So there's a tremendous amount of energy within the sciences, and they thought, okay, tell you what, our university is going to be scientific. Everything that we do is going to have the tools and methods of science, so it'll be legitimate and it'll be amazing. That's where Schleiermacher comes in. He said, look, I have a way for us to do this within the humanities and within theology. We can be scientific. The way we'll be scientific is to use the modern field of history. They had a sense before this of what had happened before, but the discipline of history, you couldn't go to the University of Berlin and major in history. It just wasn't really a discipline. Every discipline had its history, but you didn't study history. That had been changing, and he said, look, we'll take this modern discipline of history with its unique tools, those scientific tools of history, and we'll study theology scientifically. We'll study it historically. So what is theology? Theology is the history of religious experience. As we talk about God, we're not going to talk about God so much as we're going to talk about the history of religious experience. So as groups, as churches throughout history have had these religious experiences, we'll group them into genres of experience, and we'll talk about that. That's what theology is. Okay. So, how does that all relate to the doctrine of the atonement? Prior to this, when people tried to talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and I love that the image here is of a living tree, right? The atonement isn't just about death. I tell my students, if your goal is to get divorced someday, the first thing you have to do is get married. And if your goal is to resurrect from the dead, well, you need to die. The atonement is fundamentally about the resurrection, which includes the negative work of death. So I love that image. So prior to Schleiermacher, prior to the early 1800s, when theologians talked about the atonement, the work accomplished through Christ's death and resurrection, the approach was sort of a poetic, let me count the ways. Okay? So what happened? It's like, well, how much time do you have? Right? It's a little bit like asking someone about a favorite hobby. And depending if you like the hobby or not, you know whether or not you want them to get talking about that subject. Like, if you don't like boats, then you don't ask them about boats. Right? On the other hand, if you're into woodworking and you ask them a question, you know you'll get well, what do you want to talk about? There are all these things I love about this subject. So the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, wow, where do we begin? Okay? We can talk about the doctrine of creation. We can relate it to the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. We can think about how it relates to the sacraments. There's that sort of diversity. We can think about all sorts of different dimensions to sin. So in Athanasius, probably my favorite book on the atonement ever. If you're going to pick up one book on the atonement because of this, it's Athanasius' On the Incarnation. He thinks of the whole problem of sin in terms of corruption. It's not that he's against the idea of guilt. Like, yeah, we're guilty. But the fundamental problem, as he thinks of it, is that we are corrupt. And it's not corruption in the sense of political corruption. It's corruption in the sense of we are beings who are fragmented and decaying and moving towards non-being. We were brought out of nothing by the Creator, and because we've broken, we've sundered our relationship with God as it was meant to be. We're collapsing into non-being. So what is the work of Christ? It's a matter of the incorruptible God becoming man so that we can be made incorruptible creatures, which is a totally foreign way for us to think about the atonement. But for Athanasius, it was quite natural. And we can go on from there. When Thomas Aquinas is thinking about the Passion, he'll ask a question and we'll think, okay, there's an answer. And he'll say, well, there are 7 answers, right? But that's not a weird thing about Thomas Aquinas. That's him just channeling the whole patristic tradition. So what's going on in the atonement? 18 things, right? But really, some of those branch out into 3, and this other one actually is 5. So really, the point isn't to list the exact number of things. It's to say, if this is God's work of reconciling all things to himself, then we should expect the atonement to be about a lot of things, which includes a whole range of different aspects of sin, divine character, bringing in all sorts of different doctrines. Yeah. So, for example, Jonathan Edwards, when he's writing about the atonement, he has a little sermon on the wisdom of God displayed in the way of salvation. And he just launches into all these things being accomplished by Christ. He's talking about the Trinity. He's talking about the angels. The death and resurrection is related to all things in creation. Jump forward just a generation or two when someone writes a book about Jonathan Edwards, and it's called The Edwardsian Theory of the Atonement. Yeah. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. I had to make sure it was tonight for a second. It is tonight. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so before Schleiermacher and Bauer, people would just talk about all the things being accomplished by the life, death, and resurrection. Edwards fits in that trajectory. After Schleiermacher, people started talking about theories of the atonement. So why do we talk about theories of the atonement? Where did that come from? A brief story. I was getting ready to head off to do my PhD in theology to study the doctrine of the atonement. I've been studying the atonement my whole adult life. I'm coming up on a quarter century of studying the atonement, so go figure. And as I was heading out, we had a retired pastor at our church, and he knew I wanted to study the atonement. So he looked at me with this kind of mischievous look, and he said, "So which theory of the atonement do you believe in?" Which is a little bit like the commercial I saw where Abraham Lincoln's wife asked him, "Does this dress make me look fat?" And Lincoln, of course, who doesn't lie, sits there, Okay? So this pastor knew he was in trouble. So this pastor knew he was asking me a loaded question, all right? Because it's just common knowledge in all seminaries, there are 3 main theories of the atonement, okay? This is coming largely from Gustav Aulén, but he was working with a whole tradition before him. There's the early church that believed in Christus Victor, that is, God became man in order to defeat Satan. There's the satisfaction theory of the atonement that was initiated by Anselm, although there were predecessors, became penal substitution. That's one version of satisfaction theory. And then there's the exemplarist theory, which came from Peter Abelard, where God became man in order to give us an example of love so compelling that we would love him in return. So that's the way the atonement is taught. And this pastor knew that. But he also knew what we all know, that, well, God became man to do all 3 of those things. Okay? But the way the doctrine is taught, there are 3 main theories, and we have to pick among them. So where does this language come from? It came from Schleiermacher and from his student, Ferdinand Christian Bauer. If theology is the study of the history of religious experience, then doctrine is a reflection of the history of that experience. And every age will have its sort of flavor of religious experience depending on the needs, the whims, the cultural influences. So every age will have its own way of thinking. What's happening when I have these feelings related to the cross, related to the death and resurrection of Jesus? Every age will have its theory. And so what they did was they started divvying up eras into theories of the atonement. And that's how we've learned how to think. Basically, from 1850 on, as soon as a country came into contact with F.C. Bauer's theology, how they did the atonement changed. Instead of interacting with key figures and like key villains and just and doing polemic discourse or whatever, but thinking about the work of Christ, all of them began to include a chapter on the history of the doctrine of the atonement and its different eras and its theories. And that's how it goes. Scotland, England, the United States, around 1850, as soon as Bauer entered the discourse, entered the works of theologians, how they did the atonement changed. Now, what's the problem with that? All right? Does that matter? It's just theory language. Who cares? Well, sometimes the words we use don't matter that much. Right? A student counted how many times other students in a seminar said the word like. Right? It was becoming a rather long list, but he also noticed that one of my colleagues was saying the word like a fair bit and started counting that as well. And somewhat embarrassingly, my colleague said the word like more times than all the students combined. All right? Now, the word like really doesn't matter very much. Okay? So does the word theory matter very much? I would like to suggest that it matters an awful lot. Okay? So if we have a theory about something, it's meant to be an explanation of why something is the case in a way that competes with other possible explanations of why that thing is the case. So for example, we could come up with theories about why we have a stained glass window here, right? And we could come up with, we could come up with conspiracy theories. We could have theories about a donor. We could have a theory about, Christian aesthetics. Like every building should have stone, wood, and glass. We'd have a lot of different explanations. But normally, the theories one of them is meant to be preeminent. This one does the explaining. This is it. Okay? We can say, okay, several of these theories actually jointly explain the stained glass window, but normally we're just used to the language, detective fiction, police shows, Sherlock Holmes, right? We can have different explanations. One of them will work. Okay? So what does that do to our patterns of thinking? It cultivates a pattern of thinking in which there is one ring to rule them all, one explanation to rule them all. So which is it? So even if I responded to that retired pastor in my church, well, I believe all of them, which is how I responded to him. We still want to say, yeah, but one of them's central. Like one of them's the heart. Right? One of them's the foundation. Like we'll find some word like that and say, surely one of these has to be like the. And then the others can relate. Okay? That gets really hard to do, though, reading back in the history of doctrine. Augustine will say things that sound like penal substitution, but he won't develop it at length. And he'll say a lot more about Christ's work as healer, how the death and resurrection is a work that heals us, right? Or Thomas Aquinas will say a lot that sounds like penal substitution, but then it'll go off in wildly different directions. The doctrine just won't let us choose one core thing. And the same thing ends up being true of Scripture, right? So we'll think, for example, about Leviticus and say, oh, look, there's an animal, it's slaughtered in our place, it bore the guilt, we are no longer punished. And then you attend to it and you realize, wait a minute, the goat that was bearing the guilt is actually sent away. It's not sacrificed at all. And the one that is sacrificed, the emphasis isn't on the death. What the priest would do would take the blood and then cleanse everything. But if it's cleansing everything, then that's just a fundamentally different category than guilt and punishment. Now, different category doesn't mean bad. It doesn't mean one has to be right and the other has to be wrong. It just means different. Like, my wife can be beautiful and wise. I don't have to choose between them. And I'm also not going to limit my description of my wife to those two words. She's also quite short. But to be fair, because my son who plays basketball wants to know, why did I marry someone so short? He's a runt. He's only 6 feet tall. And he's frustrated with me. And my answer is, well, I fell in love with her before either of us grew. We met when we were 5. Right? But the ability to be able to approach Leviticus and say, yes, this is a way of understanding the work of Christ, but it's a work of cleansing where the holy God cleanses us of our sin, which is perfectly compatible with penal substitution, but it's a fundamentally different logic grounded in holiness rather than in justice. Those are not at odds with each other, but they're just two different dimensions of the same thing. Okay? Theory language pushes us towards thinking about one core central dimension. And we need to learn to think in terms of lots of dimensions. Okay. So, the best way, I think, in order to have the right posture towards the Christ saving work is to do exactly what Mike Allen was saying. And by the way, when I found out about the goodie bag with the books from these guys, I thought, oh, I want that. And then I realized, wait, I already have all their books. I love reading these guys' books, so I don't need it. Yep. The best posture, sort of intellectual and spiritual posture to have towards the work of Christ as we're reading Scripture, as we're reading the history of doctrine, is to try to contemplate the fittingness of God's saving work. Instead of theories, instead of looking for the right theory, we want to contemplate fittingness. There are two angles to that. Fittingness has to do with the relationship between an act and character. Like that was a uniquely fitting act. Like in a situation where this week I was coaching my 8th graders basketball, and it was a typical La Mirada basketball game. Parents were yelling at each other, and we had a fight after the game. I kid you not. Okay, so in a tense situation, what does it look like to act rightly? What's a fitting course of action? Well, it's a way of acting that brings everything about my character to bear on the situation so that it's an action filled with, hopefully, wisdom, grace, patience. Like to try to bring the whole of my character, in as much as my character is good, to bear on the situation. So I act in a fitting way, in an elegant, becoming way to who I am. And at the same time, a fitting action is one that takes into account the whole array of events, causes, characters, the whole context, so that with as few actions, with as beautiful actions as possible, I can address as many of the dynamics in the room as possible. Right? So it's fitting if it's an elegant way of bringing my character to bear on a really complex situation. So what's going on in the doctrine of the atonement? This is God's fitting act. It's a way of God bringing his whole character, not just one attribute. God's attributes don't come all by themselves, right? God's whole character to bear on an incredibly complex situation. Political, sociological, right? Individual. He's dealing with individual needs. He's navigating tensions between Jew and Gentile or Jew and Roman. Like to paint the whole picture, there are so many things going on. And then Scripture compounds the difficulty by saying, reconciling to himself all things in heaven, on earth, and under the earth. So this massively complex situation, God acts fittingly by himself becoming man in order to act in just the right way to bring about all of his creating and saving purposes. if we set ourselves to contemplate the fittingness of God's action, we have just the right posture to understand just how much is going on in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Okay, so I'm going to sketch two ways that this sort of gets traction, one at more length than the other. I'm going to look at how this relates to how we read Anselm's theology of the atonement. Your very own David Hogg wrote a fantastic book on Anselm's theology that I absolutely love. I've told him that several times, not just to make him feel good. I just tell him once if it was just to make him feel good, but I've told him several times. So I'm going to unpack how this relates to how we read Anselm, and then I'm going to just briefly sketch how this relates to thinking about areas we don't normally think about in regard to the atonement, such as shame. Okay, so with Anselm, his is the most developed account of the life, death, or the death and resurrection of Jesus in the first 1,100 years of the church. Right? So there are amazing predecessors in Augustine and Athanasius and Cyril and John of Damascus, Maximus the Confessor. There's some incredible work that those theologians wrote on the doctrine of the atonement. But Anselm gives it a rigor and a depth that is just distinctive. If you want to study the atonement, you have to read that book. Every book written on that subject that's anywhere near the ballpark of responsibility will cite that book. Okay? For the last 250 years, we've thought about Anselm in terms of the three main theories of the atonement. Okay? So we learned for the last 250 years that atonement comes in theories. So then, when we turned to Anselm, we asked, okay, what's his theory? He doesn't make it easy for us, right? Around chapter 6 of book 1, he says, look, he summarizes a traditional view of the atonement where God became man in order to give the devil his due. Right? The devil had rights. A little bit like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the witch, Edmund is hers. And if he is taken from her, then all of Narnia will be overthrown in fire and blood, and Aslan doesn't disagree. Okay? So the witch, or Satan, has rights. God became man in order to give Satan what he needed to sort of satisfy the rights of Satan so that we could be rescued. That sounds like a critique of the previous 1,000 years. And I have a fantastic pile of quotations from Anselm scholars, theologians focusing on doctrine of the atonement, who all say what Anselm does is he discards the first millennium of church teaching about the work of Christ and says Satan is not relevant to the doctrine of the atonement. What he does is he gives us an image and he says, look, it's like we're painting on a cloud or we're painting on water. You can try, and you might be able to make a beautiful picture, but what we really want to do is we want a better foundation on which to put that image. Forget the water. I want a nice wooden background for this image. I've been telling my art students about this for years, hoping that one of them would try to figure out a way to paint on water, because I want a painting of the Passion done on water. And I've thought a whole bunch of ways to do it, including using nail polish, which would float and then dry, and then you could paint on it. And so one of my students took me up on it. It didn't work too well. But anyway, so he gives us this image, and he's like, what we want, instead of painting on water, what we want to do is paint on wood. And it sounds like he's discarding the first theory of the atonement to do with Satan in order to advance a new one known as the theory of satisfaction. What happens when we try to contemplate the fittingness of God's action as we study Anselm? Start noticing a whole bunch of things. For example, Satan's everywhere in Anselm's writings, in his letters, his devotional treatises, and all throughout his theological works. So Satan's everywhere. In his biography of Anselm, Eadmer says that Anselm would cast Satan out of people, and once he put out a fire by making the sign of the cross. Right? So if someone's trying to jettison Satan from their thinking, Anselm did it very strangely. Right? But here, the really important thing is that right at the end of the book, in book 2, chapter 19, Anselm, when he's wrapping up the argument, he says, okay, why did God become man? Did he owe Satan anything? Right? He comes back to that question. He says, no, he didn't owe him anything. But you know who did owe something to Satan? We did. We owed something to Satan. We owed him defeat. He overthrew us. We owe him a defeat. Or more properly, we owe God a defeat of Satan. Because we failed to do what we were set out to do. Like, we were supposed to obey God and ignore Satan. And what did we do? We obeyed Satan. So we owe God a defeat of Satan. So what Anselm says is, well, so why did God become man? God became man so that in him we might give God what we owed. We owed God a defeat of Satan. God became man in order to defeat Satan for us, giving God what we owed. Now, is that a Christus Victor theory of the atonement? Now we're into patristic. This is a patristic question. What did theologians for the first 1,000 years of the church say? I've found a couple theologians who said that Satan had rights. Origen said some things to that effect. And then Gregory of, I always get them mixed up, Nazianzus or Nyssa. I should probably have a note on this, but whatever. I think it was Gregory of Nazianzus said that there were rights that Satan had. Almost everyone else will say he didn't. So effectively, this was an intramural debate. Did Satan have proper rights or no? Augustine is probably really helpful in this regard, especially because Anselm said, yeah, everything I wrote is in Augustine somewhere. He doesn't cite his sources, but he just says, yeah, it's all in Augustine. Augustine says, yeah, Satan had rights. He had jurisdiction over us. Well, not quite. God, of course, has jurisdiction, and within God's patience and providence, he allowed him sort of a relative jurisdiction. Right? And when we get to the Leo the Great and his sermons, and we know that Anselm's mentor had read those sermons, so Anselm might have gotten them from him. We don't know what works he had. Basically, we have a passage where Leo the Great is saying exactly what Anselm says. Right? God became man in order to give to God a defeat of Satan. Okay? So what was Anselm doing? He was actually summing up the entire patristic heritage and affirming it. But we, because we think in terms of theories, miss it and think, oh, he's not doing Christus Victor, he's doing satisfaction, when actually that's not the case at all. He's summing up the patristic heritage, and he's trying to shift that same image onto a firmer foundation, showing why it was necessary, but not to change the image. Maybe you've seen hydro dipping on YouTube. All right, hydro dipping is where they'll lay down an image, I'm not quite sure how, on water, on really still water. And then the substance it on sort of dissipates and the image is just floating there. And then you can take an object that has a strange shape to it, slowly dip it into the water, remove it, and now the image is on that object. So I don't know, if you want the hood of your car with a really cool image on it, they might hydro dip it. What Anselm is doing is he's hydro dipping the whole patristic heritage on an account of the necessity of the incarnation, trying to affirm it. Why does this matter? On the one hand, it's totally nerdy. It's just Anselm. Who cares? We just need to, we need to preach and minister to our congregations. Here's why it matters. We're taught to think that there's massive discontinuity in the history of the church about the work of Christ. Ever since my boys were little, I've had Lightning McQueen with me when I spoke. I've never knocked him to the ground. All right. Now you know. We're taught, reading History of Doctrine, about massive discontinuity in how the church has thought about the saving work of Christ. But Anselm is the keystone that supports the whole arch of that, because he's the crazy guy who changed everything. if there isn't massive discontinuity, if he's affirming what came before him but trying to give it a firmer foundation, then what we have is massive continuity in how the church has proclaimed the saving work of Christ throughout millennia. And I find that to be an immense joy and consolation. Like, if God became man in order to reconcile all things, shouldn't our thinking about the reconciliation be reconciled? If the work is a work of at one ment, of making things one, then wouldn't it be an ugly sign if our thinking about the work of Christ was fragmented? And what it turns out we have, I think, is a massive vision of unity with loads of different emphases, but massive unity across the history of the doctrine. Okay. And one more brief little vision of why this sort of thinking about theory matters. If we think in terms of theories, then the predominant way that evangelicals broadly construed have thought, or conservative theologians have thought broadly about the atonement, is penal substitution. And penal substitution, well, it's a whole family of views. You can unpack it in lots of ways. You have to do it well, right? But whatever. Penal substitution is just correct. Right? But is God more just than he is any other divine attribute? No. No, he's not. He's holy. And woe to the theologian who tries to emphasize one of those over the other, right? But he's also loving and wise, patient, and we can go on and on and on, list all these divine attributes. If the atonement is God bringing the whole divine character to bear on our need, on the need of creation, then it is the work of all of those divine attributes, and we can unpack the atonement in terms of any one of those divine attributes. Why does this matter? It matters pastorally a lot. Okay? I remember we hadn't even been married a year yet. I was working construction, and one of the guys I worked with, teenager, we swung by my apartment to pick something up. I was like, "Oh, come on in," while I grabbed whatever I needed to grab. And he said, "No." Like, "No, come on in." "No." "Dude, come in." "No." It stuck with me, obviously. I'm like, why won't this dude come into my house? This is weird. Like, there are rules of hospitality, but also rules of being a guest. Like, if you come to my front door, come in the house, right? I learned to realize later, that was probably shame. And I've been able to, because of that, to recognize it in my students sometimes. Like, if I come in, I will contaminate. And I don't want to contaminate. Like, this, from what I know of you, might be a beautiful thing, and I'm ashamed, and even though I can't say that, I don't want to bring my shame in. Okay. Which is at least as powerful as being guilty. And if we think about the crucifixion itself, Jesus was naked, hung up publicly. This wasn't a way of killing people. This is a way of shaming people to death, right? The atonement, construed this way, we're contemplating the divine fittingness, invites us to think about the way that this is the work of the God of honor, who takes upon himself our shame, so that in the resurrection, he can establish us in his honor. So we can be creatures of honor who honor others and know how to interact with shame. Now, I can't develop that at length because we all need to do our different things, and I don't get more time than anybody else. But that's the kind of the project that this way of thinking about the atonement invites us to think. Like, yes, God is a God of justice, and he takes upon himself our guilt and punishment so that we can be established in ways of righteousness. Amen. And he's the God of honor who takes upon himself our shame so that we can be established in the honor and glory of God. And then we can go on from there to more and more and more understanding of these different aspects of the death and resurrection of Jesus. Pleasure spending some time with you, and I hope it's a great day tomorrow as well. Thank you.